Welcome to another video in my van build series. In this set of videos, I'm going to tell you about my flooring strategy and show you how that came together. I'm breaking this series up into two videos. There was a lot of time and effort that went into installing the floor. There was a lot of prep work that went into the different layers. So this first segment in each video, I'm going to talk about the details of each of the layers, and then stick around to watch how that came together, and I'll tell you about what's in each part as I get to the end of the details of the floor. So the floor of the van has these corrugations in the metal. Don't have really a better word for it, and it's often referred to as corrugations. They look a little bit different than the ones that are here next to me. They're a little bit wider, different dimensions. But what you need to know is that an important part of building up the floor is to first fill those corrugations and create more of a flush surface. Don't want to leave any air gaps, and want to fill that with insulating material. So for my first layer, use this minicell closed cell foam. So this comes in a few different thicknesses, and this particular thickness that I used is the exact height of those corrugations in the metal floor of the van. So this is my base layer that both acts as a sound deadener as well as an insulator, and then give me a flush surface to build up on top of. For my second layer, I used an extruded polystyrene foam. The foam I went with is 1.5 inches thick, which gives me an R value of 7.5 for the next level of my flooring. And you can see that flooring here. This gives me a really good base to build on top of with my subfloor and everything else that came after it, which I'll talk about here in a second. But what this does is also gives me a lot of R value for the space that it takes up. I've seen some other builds use a thinner extruded polystyrene foam, XPS foam, and they come in different brands, and so the color may be different. But I've seen other builds use a thinner foam instead of an 1.5 inches. I chose to go with 1.5 inches, mostly because I don't plan to have a permanent heater installed. So for the places where I'm going to be where it's going to be a little bit colder, I want to have the best insulation possible from all sides of my van, including the floor, to just make it a little bit cozier, and again, for those really deep winter conditions, be able to live and not need as much permanent heat as some of the other builds that I've seen. Now, heat does rise, but if I can prevent the heat from entering the van from below, all the better. For my third layer, I used a 1/2 inch thick marine grade plywood. Now, the reason I used a marine grade plywood is that the adhesives are better rated to handle moisture. And now I'm doing what I can to make sure the wood won't be exposed to moisture, but it will just make sure that the wood itself is more resilient to the changes in condensation and conditions that I'll be living in. Using plywood for this third layer also gives me a structural layer that I can secure my build to from the inside as I build up the rest of my structure. For the last layer of my floor, I finished off with a sheet vinyl. Now, I really like the sheet vinyl because it's a relatively neutral tone, but it still looks really great, and it's going to hold up to anything I could throw at it for the life of my van. In this video, part 2 of my flooring series, you're going to see mostly of how my third layer, the plywood layer, came together. What you're not going to see a lot of is how the vinyl sheet came together. Part of this is I just wasn't in the mood to record, so I'm sorry to disappoint. But what I can tell you is that I cut the vinyl sheet to a little bit wider than the width of the van, and I started from one corner of the van and lined up the straight edge with that side of the van. And then instead of pre-cutting everything before I got the sheet into the van, I cut everything as I went, as I was laying down the vinyl in the van, to make sure I can get as close as possible to all of the different seams and edges in the van. Then after I had everything cut and laid out, I used a vinyl adhesive to lift up and do work on laying down and rolling out the vinyl onto that adhesive with the rolling pin, one section at a time. So I know a lot of recommendations or installs don't necessarily need the adhesive, but I thought the adhesive would be really good for my application so that the floor doesn't shift around in the van, and I can feel confident that it's not going to go anywhere regardless of what I throw at it. And finally, to finish it off, I'm using a thin bead of GE Silicon 2 around the edge of the floor between the vinyl and the metal, that way creating a waterproof seam to make sure that no water gets in behind or underneath all the different layers of the floor, to just make sure that my floor really does last without any concern of water damaging either the van or the floor.
Here's the start of me cutting out the plywood flooring. As with most of the plywood cuts you'll see me do, I first tape over the lines where I'll be cutting. This is to limit splintering of the wood to either side of the cutting line, as saws can bring up pieces of the top plywood layer. The tape applies enough pressure that the layers don't splinter and I have cleaner cuts. As you can see in the different parts of the video, I use both a circular saw and a jigsaw for cutting the wood. I use the XPS foam pieces as templates for the plywood layer. The plywood layer takes a little longer to measure and prepare for cutting than just direct templates because I don't want the plywood and XPS layers to line up perfectly. By offsetting the layers, I'm ensuring the seams are misaligned. Misalignment is normally a bad thing, but in this case it's good, I swear. This means that if for some reason I have any draft coming up from the base layers of my flooring, it won't flow straight up to my top vinyl sheet layer. It'll run into a flat plywood surface. This means I'm preventing any cold spots by putting in the extra measurement and layout work. I lightly sand the edges and some of the main surfaces of the wood to prepare for paint. I protect the wood layer from changes in moisture by coating the plywood in a layer of Kills Indoor-Outdoor Primer. This helps prevent mildew and changes in the wood, such as warping, which can be caused by the elements I'll be living in. Using the primer means that my floor stays nicer for longer. Since everything is built up off the floor, it's a no-brainer. Starting with the rear pieces of plywood, I apply foam board adhesive directly to the XPS and then lay the plywood on top. One piece at a time, I adhere the plywood and then immediately apply weight to help the plywood set evenly from piece to piece. You can see that I also had aluminum tape laid down across the foam seams for some extra draft coverage. I left all the items in the van for almost a week while the adhesive set. I don't show most of the work I do on the vinyl sheet, but what you do see here is me finishing the edge seams. I do this with GE silicone too. This creates a true seal around the edges that will last, and of course, it also cleans up the look of those seams.
Thanks for watching part 2 of how my floor came together in my van build series. If you've got some comments, some feedback, please throw that in the comments below. As always, please like and subscribe. And then if you want some more details of the products I used and some of the materials, please check out the description for some more information. Of course, a link to my website where eventually I'll have a lot more details of how this build came together and certainly a lot of photographs as well. Stay tuned for the next videos that are going to be coming out soon.